It's day 17 of the Karen Read trial. I'm going to give you my daily recap. I'm in the Cape this weekend for Memorial Day, and it was a chaotic day watching the trial, but it was one day that I knew that I didn't want to miss. I had a beautiful day today on the patio watching at my father-in-law's new backyard. We even put it on the TV. On the stand today, the prosecution called Brian Higgins. It was mentioned on Wednesday that we needed to finish Brian Higgins' testimony today. Brian Higgins is an ATF agent. He was in the home at 34 Fairview the night that John O'Keefe died, and we are introduced to a whole new side story, some flirty text messages between him and Karen Read. I'm going to break it all down for you. Karen Read's attorneys have previously said, and in opening statements, they have said that Brian Higgins is the means and the motive to killing John O'Keefe. So today, bombshells were expected. I don't know if we got bombshells. I want to hear what you think in the comments, but let's go over everything. Brian Higgins is introduced because he is friends with Brian Albert, who is the homeowner at 34 Fairview. They went together to a funeral for a fellow police officer in New York City, and they drove back early because of the impending snowstorm, and they went out to eat together, and then they met up with the whole crew at the Waterfall Bar. Brian Albert left the first bar, the Hillside, first, and then Higgins followed shortly after. It's important to note that Brian Higgins was driving the white Jeep that night that had the plow attached to it. It's been mentioned in other witnesses' testimony. We've seen the surveillance footage from the waterfall of Brian Higgins and Brian Albert doing the play wrestling. This was the other guy that was doing it. So they leave the waterfall bar, and there's the open invitation to go back to Brian Albert's house. And he says that he is the first person to arrive. So it's mentioned that he doesn't see Colin Albert, which Nicole and Brian Albert said that they saw Colin Albert on their way in and his way out. But he was the first person there, and he said he didn't see him at all. Brian Higgins says that he was one of the first or so people to leave the Albert residence. He left between 1:40 and 2 a.m. and he went home and he just went to bed. He testified for Mr. Lally that he received a phone call from Chief Berkowitz. He's the former police chief of Canton PD who lives kind of catty corner to Brian Albert. He's also a good friend of Brian Higgins. And Brian Higgins, actually, because he's an ATF officer, he has so many connections within law enforcement, and his office is actually inside the Canton Police Department. He testified that he arrived to the Albert residence the morning of the 29th, and people were very distraught. The weather conditions were not good. His first interview with Trooper Proctor from the Mass State Police was on February 3rd, which is several days after, considering the fact that he was inside the home and John O'Keefe was found outside dead. Brian Higgins provided his cell phone to the state police because he had a lot of text messages between Karen Read and John O'Keefe. We learn about an occasion where he was invited to go watch a Patriots football game. I believe it was around January 16th at the O'Keefe residence. Karen Read was there, and John O'Keefe's niece and nephew were there, and a few other friends, and a lot happened. So the jury goes out at this point, and then this is when we learn about all of these spicy, flirty text messages that happened between Brian Higgins and Karen Read. There were 56 pages between Brian Higgins and Karen Read. If you're very pro Karen, it was really hard to hear. There was a lot said. So Karen Read gets Brian Higgins' phone number from a bartender, I think at the Hillside or the Waterfall, I can't remember, but that's not important. So a lot of the text messages are like, how did you get my phone number? That kind of thing, but they did know each other because Brian Higgins and John O'Keefe were friends, and the whole friend circle like hung out a lot. I'm not going to read you all of the text, but it's very kind of like flirty, and he is kind of trying to just understand, why is she texting me if she's dating my friend John O'Keefe? I thought they were happy. He says that Karen's hot and witty and smart, and it's very flirty. It goes on. And she's basically saying, like, you and I are single, we're not married, we don't have any kids, we're very alike, I feel like we come from very similar neighborhoods, I feel like I just know you really well. And when I was on this trip with John in Aruba, I caught him like hooking up with this girl in the lobby who is like a close family friend of his. Okay, before I get into more text messages, they actually, on January 16th, I guess he came over and they did watch that Patriots game, and Karen plants a kiss on Brian Higgins. So that's a bombshell. He testified that it was just a peck, but it was more than a friendly kiss. It was like romantic, and he was like not expecting it at all. So Karen is like enticing Brian Higgins to like meet up with him for a drink. Supposedly they do end up meeting up, but nothing happens. He was like, I don't even know if we finished one drink, and that was really it. So the really flirty text messages started around January 16th, and one of the last text messages is on the 22nd of January, and then he kind of like tries to continue the conversation, and nothing happens. On Friday night, which would have been January 28th, when they went to the waterfall, I guess like she wasn't talking to him at all, and she was obviously there with John, and so he had texted her, well, and then in the morning on Saturday, she texted him, John died, and that was at 11 something, but he already knew, and I'll get into that. And here's me just living my best life today, at the pool with an AirPod in, listening to the trial. We get into the cross-examination right before lunchtime, and Alan Jackson wants to know how close he is to the Albert family. Brian Higgins is very good friends with Brian Albert and also with Kevin Albert, because Kevin is a Canton police officer who works in the same building as Brian. Jackson wants to know if Brian Higgins had any romantic feelings for Karen Reed, and he says, I wouldn't say that. She was just a very attractive woman. He won't agree that he had feelings for her. We have the lunch break, and then Brian Higgins is questioned about all of the text messages, and it's just really deep with Alan Jackson asking him about them. It's actually brought up that Higgins shared with his boss, who was a part of this whole law enforcement group that they know, that Karen Reed kissed him. Like Jackson has done in everybody else's questioning, he brings up all of the grand jury testimony. So he wants to compare what you said at the grand jury versus what you're saying today, and if it doesn't match up, he's coming for you. It's brought up that he is best friends with Kenny Berkowitz, who is the former police department chief for the Canton PD. He even gave a speech at Kenny's retirement party and said, if you ever want to hide a body, Kenny's your guy. So we hear about a grand jury testimony on June 1st that was given, and he said under oath that he saw a tall, dark-haired man enter the home that night at 34 Fairview. He came inside briefly, he recognized the person, but he didn't know them, and he briefly spoke with two of the girls that were there. This sight of the tall, dark-haired man was never brought up to Lally or any of the investigators on the case, and it leads me to believe that he's hinting at the fact that it was Colin Albert. His testimony is that he parked his Jeep in front of the mailbox, which kind of goes with some of the witnesses that night. And he says that they were looking on pictures in the home on the first floor. He never went upstairs or to the basement. And he's asked, if somebody were to say that you went upstairs to look at pictures, what would that mean? Would that have meant that you were in the basement? And he doesn't understand, and there's a lot of objections, and he says no. Leaving the house, he never saw a body or anything on the lawn at the home. So his story has evolved a little bit over the past 2 years about where he went when he left 34 Fairview. And originally we heard that he went to the police station where his office was. I'm just reading my notes here. And he said to fulfill administrative obligations. For the record, he wasn't interviewed by Mass State Police until 5 days after John died. He says he was woken up by a call from Chief Berkowitz around 6:30 or so, but his call records actually say that he received a phone call from Brian Albert around 2:22 a.m. He says he has no recollection of the calls, he didn't talk to him, but there was a 22-second phone call between the two of them at that hour. My jaw actually hit the ground when he said it was a butt dial, because we've heard about this time and time again, but he sleeps with his phone on his nightstand with his ringer on. He has no roommates, no dog. How is that a butt dial? So he goes over to the Albert residence the next day because he hears from Brian Albert what happened, and he doesn't think to tell any of the investigators or the chief of police, who is his friend, that he was there the night that John died. So the next morning, he goes to Canton PD. He's not scheduled to work at all. At 9:23 a.m., he was granted access to the Sally Port, and this is going to be where Karen Reed's car is brought in. There's a lot of phone calls all day between him and Brian Albert, Kevin Albert, and Kenny Berkowitz. He enters the Sally Port at 5:36 p.m. and 90 minutes later, Karen Reed's car was delivered. He leaves Canton PD for the day around 5:56 p.m. and there is actually video surveillance when Karen Reed's car is delivered to the Sally Port that is missing at 5:46. We learn at the very end of the day that Brian Albert learned about the broken taillight from Brian Higgins, who was getting this insider info from Chief Berkowitz at the Canton PD. The final update is that we learned that he never handed over his cell phone. He just handed over 2 text strings that he downloaded, one from John O'Keefe, one from Karen Read, and then he destroyed his phone.